I'm Brenda Chapman, crime writer from Ottawa, and it's my great pleasure to be able to interview British Columbia crime writer Iona Whishaw today. And I'm just really thrilled. Our paths have crossed a few times over the years. And so it's a great chance for me to catch up on your writing journey. And I know it's been going just great guns, and I'm really excited to talk to you. So your latest release in the Lane Winslow series is titled Framed in Fire, and we're going to talk about that. Yes, I've got my advanced reading copy here too. We're going to talk about that, and you're going to give a short reading when we come to that part of my questioning. And anyhow, well, it's so great to see you through the magic of Zoom. I know we're on different coasts.
It is great to see you through the magic of Zoom. It is. I'm actually thrilled. I think the conference so far has been fabulous. And so I must say, I take my hat off to all the organizers.
Yeah, Mike Martin and his volunteers have just done a terrific job. Well, we're going to start by delving into your past, Iona. And my first question talks about your working career, which was in education and social work. And you also studied creative writing at UBC with your first published book, Henry and the Cow Problem, which is a picture book published by Anik Press in 1995, the first historical mystery in the Lane Winslow series. Why such a long gap between books?
Oh, such a good question. I published that first book shortly after I came out of the creative writing department. And I was still working with kids then as a sort of youth worker. And once I went into education, I think a lot of my creative energy was taken up with teaching. You know, teaching is it's an all-in kind of a thing, and I absolutely adored it. I felt like it was my life's calling. And even after when I became a vice principal, and then I was a principal for almost 10 years before I retired, you know, these are jobs where I didn't feel that there was a lot of the kind of psychic energy you need. You know, I really put everything that I had into my work. And then I had one of those things where I realized I still want to write, and I better not wait until I retire. So in my last 2 years, I got up, you know, sort of an hour and a half early at 5 o'clock and wrote a little bit. My goal was 400 words every morning. And that's how really this whole thing started.
Yeah, a lot of writers get up very early and have other jobs, and it's difficult. But why did you settle on the mystery genre?
You know, I've always loved mysteries. You know, it's really, I just find it the most compelling reading. I was a Nancy Drew girl, you know, when I was a kid. And you know, I have some mysteries that I really love, like The Elegance of Dorothy L. Sayers, and the clean writing of a guy like Stuart Kaminsky. I mean, there's such a range, you know, the wonderful Ian Rankin. I mean, your books, there's so many different kinds of genres that are all, to me, novels. Of course, you know, when you graduate from an MFA program, you want to be a novelist. And this is my way of being a novelist, you know, and it just works for me. And I like series. I like to read series. I like to find out what's happening to people across the years. So.
Yeah, okay. And you've spoken before about your parents being spies during the Cold War. And your protagonist, Lane Winslow, has a similar secretive past, working as a spy during World War II. Can you speak a bit about how your parents influenced Lane's creation? And is she at all like your mother?
Thank you for that. My father is innocent of all spying charges. He was a bomber pilot, and you know, you see him a little bit reflected, although he's nothing at all like Inspector Darling, but Inspector Darling is a bomber pilot during the war. And so that's where there's a little bit of crossover. But my mother came from a family where her father had been a spy. And I found out quite recently, from such a roundabout way, it can hardly be credited, that he had two brothers and they were both working for MI6. before the war and during the war and presumably after, I don't know. My grandfather was killed during the war in 1943, so I never knew him. All I knew about him was what my mother told me. And then very, very late in life, she kind of tossed off as a little, frou-frou, that she had been doing intelligence work in South Africa. And, she made it seem so really nothing at all. But when you really stop to think about what she was doing, it's terrifying. I mean, when I watch detective shows where people go undercover and stuff, I can't even look until that whole part of it's over, right? So just imagining my mother, who spoke perfect German and Russian and French, going off and pretending to be a young German girl and entertaining German officers to get information and that kind of thing, it actually makes your hair stand on end. I mean, we live in such a different world. And so in many ways, Lane is like her. My mother was extremely beautiful as a young woman and extremely accomplished. And she had the additional thing of being very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? We can say bohemian, but it was more than that. I mean, if I give you the example that when I was 3 and my brother was about 10 or 11, she went hitchhiking with truck drivers to Alaska and left us in the care of someone because my father was away and she was bored. So it's that kind of thing Lane doesn't do. Like, Darling's always complaining that she's being dangerous, but he has no idea what my mother
It's your mom.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, in lots of ways, yes, she is. Lane comes from a fairly not aristocratic background, but certainly an upper class background. And my mother came from a very upper class background, but she absolutely adored people and worked among. She spent the last few years just about of her life being on the in the fire department of Windermere, which is a tiny community in the interior of BC, because she just loved being there with the people who were there, and so she was. Lane has that same kind of man of the people type qualities, I think, that my mother had.
So she was a real extrovert, your mom.
Yes, I would say she was. Yes, let's go with that. It's hard to tell because I think she's one of those extroverted introverts,
Okay, so had a real inner life, but also liked people. Yeah, really fascinating. So the point of view in your book, I've just read Framed in Fire, which is great. I found it an interesting choice. You write in the third person omniscient, where you as the author can see into the minds of every character, sometimes in the same scene. One of the most difficult voices to master, I would say. Did you consciously choose this point of view, or did it come naturally as you wrote? And you do it very well. It's very effective. But I just wonder your process to choose that.
It's funny, I never thought there was any other choice. When I started writing, that's just what I did. And I do notice that an awful lot of books, in particular mysteries, are kind of in the first person, an awful lot of them. And I'm not sure how I do it that, because I want to be everywhere and see everything. And I want my readers to be there as well. So I think it was just a very natural choice because of how I want to experience the world and stories. I want to know what's going on behind the scenes all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that third person omniscient allows for that.
It does, yeah. And you're in the minds of so many characters, but it's sort of peppered throughout. I mean, you have your main characters that you really talk about and are in their minds the most, but every so often you get the reader gets a glimpse of another character's.
Well, yeah, and I want even the most minor character to be meaningful, to be real, however obnoxious or small a place that character has in any given story. Because now I've learned, this is book 9, I've learned that even the tiniest character can nose his way back in to other books. They're quite amazing.
Yeah, no, it was really good read. And I think, your fans are just going to love this book. It's very interesting. And we're going to get to that a bit more later on. The series has a large following, and each book has been a bestseller. Besides your good writing and interesting plot lines, to what do you attribute the huge popularity of the series?
Gosh, I know that what I can tell you is what people tell me. I do get quite a few letters from readers, and a lot of people find them comforting, which I think is a kind of funny thing, because they're really, I don't fill the books with blood and gore, but I don't shy away from difficult subjects or the fact that someone is, lying dead on someone's floor, wherever it happens to be, in a rowboat. So and I think the comforting part of it comes from maybe from the decency of the characters, and the that you can count on them, that Darling's never going to you hope, you imagine that Darling, for example, will never cross a line. That Lane will never suddenly become a shrew and gossip. She has little moments. She's there's a character in King's Cove she always has quite a bit of impatience with, and so she'll sort of think things, but she doesn't come out and say them. So I think that's part of it, and I think people enjoy the characters. And I think there is something about writing a historical novel, and that is that, for reasons which escape me entirely, but is true even for me, there is a comfort to going and hiding in the past. You feel like the world was simpler then. And I remember listening to Ian Rankin today, talking about even writing in the 70s, there was no forensics, there was no CCTV, there was no cell phones and all of that rigmarole. Well, in 1947, there really wasn't any of that stuff. And so I think people take comfort in that without really thinking about all the kinds of attitudes that people had that were so repellent. If we look back on them now, and I kind of suggest that a little bit in this book about some of the ways that people felt, and very sadly continue to feel, about the other in the world, kind of thing. So I'm going to just say that maybe about that. I think people enjoy them because they're a little bit comforting, and they can rely on the decency of the characters.
And I think also the setting is part of it, that British Columbia setting. It's beautiful.
Yes, absolutely. I was having a discussion with someone the other day about someone was interviewing me and asking about if I'd ever been tempted to just remove them to somewhere else. And I know that early on I was advised, that I should set my books in the United States because Americans are not interested in Canadians. And of course, that's patently ridiculous. Look at Gail Bowen and Louise Penny and all those people who write about wonderful Canada. And I just realized when I was saying it, how absolutely intrinsically connected the places with the stories. You cannot, in fact, take them out and have them be the same stories. The place is critical.
I agree. And I mean, can you imagine how ludicrous it would be to tell the Scandinavian writers that they have to set their books in the US? Like, why are we telling Canadian authors that we have to set their books?
No, I'm with you 100%.
Yeah. Okay, so readers are always curious about an author's writing process. And I've noticed over the course of all the panels and interviews that people are asked, are you a pantser or are you a plotter? And so I'm going to ask you, Iona, are you a pantser or a plotter?
I am a pantser, and I don't regret it. Because I don't think I would know how to be any other way. I started writing very, very late, and I don't, for me, plotting is maybe a little bit like doing an outline, before you write an essay. And even as an English teacher, I never really taught kids to write outlines because for me, it was a foreign way to organize thoughts. It was a way of locking them into little boxes. And, we were given, what the hell were they called? Anyway, organizers that kids could write ideas into, introduction, paragraph 1, 2, 3, conclusion kind of thing. And I just don't think people think that way. Now, that's probably wrong. It's just that I don't think that way. So for me, it literally is sit down. I have a little image in my head. This is at the beginning of any book, and I just start to write, and we'll see where it goes.
A lot of editing as a result. Do you have to go back?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that's always the problem with being a pantser, is that you can write yourself into a corner, and then you have to try to sort through that. So you do reach a point at a certain place in a book where you really need to stop and think, okay, where the heck is all this going? Where am I headed to? And so you do a little, even then I don't do very much. I just try to think about, what's going to be necessary for a reader. What information are they going to need to carry forward? And that's kind of where I go. So that's why my books are written in these kind of chunks where I move around in time and place and so on, because I'm really thinking, what more does my reader need? So in that way, I think I also discover what's going on. Darling and Lane and I all arrive at the same place at the same time.
I think readers would be surprised to know how many people are, or how many authors are pantsers.
I think readers would, because I think mysteries typically are considered to be the kind of books that, above all, you plot. And I'm sure people imagine that we're all like P.G. Woodhouse, with 2x5 cards all over our walls that we're moving around to fit things in. And I was interviewing J.A. Jantz, Elizabeth George, Anne Hillerman in a panel in Tucson, and somebody else. Anyway, only Elizabeth George was a plotter.
Yeah.
All the rest were pantsers,
Yeah. I did a short poll, and of 5, 4 were pantsers and 1 was a plotter. So there you go. Okay, so the main storyline in your book takes place after, in all your books, takes place after the war in 1948. Everything from the turns of phrase used to the vehicles and the household appliances need to be accurate. And you do a terrific job at this. And how much time do you spend on research and fact checking these details?
I've never evaluated the time, but what I do is I'll write along and I'll say, for example, in the last book, A Lethal Lesson, there's a fridge in the cottage of the teachers, but it's a kind of poorish cottage. The community can't afford a lot. So that fridge will be quite old, right? So now I'll stop and I'll go look at, what was a fridge like in 1925 kind of thing, right? So it's that kind of a thing often where I'll go back and forth, unless I'm looking at something really big like, the home children or the Sudetenland refugees. Then I'll just stop and find some reading, find a book or something that will give me some guidance. But even by then, I've already started the writing. And sometimes I may have to stop and look things up. And often they're really, you'd be surprised where you can go wrong. But you will not be surprised, Brenda, I'm sure, as a fellow practitioner, by how quickly people will write to you to tell you that you've been wrong. And in honesty, I appreciate that very much. I keep a set of my books, and in the back, I write errata. And when somebody says to me, no, this couldn't have happened because of such and such, I send them a very nice thank you note, because I really do appreciate it. I write it down and I send it off to my publisher, and they keep it so that the next round of the book published will have the changes in them.
Well, yeah. Well, the mystery genre, the readers are just, they're looking for every clue and every detail. So
yes, and that's great, but nothing escapes them.
No. Do you have a favorite place where you like to write, and what does a typical writing day look like for you?
Well, I'm a kind of low-class Barbara Cartland. I have a very scruffy pink bathrobe. I get it on in the morning, and I get a mug of, a pot of tea and a mug, and I go sit back in bed and I write in bed.
Love
And
it.
that's where I do it. And then eventually, there'll be squawks, because we usually 3 days a week we run out and do some high intensity training. And I could just go on till probably 11 or 12, and then I more or less stop. So because I think in scenes, I will typically write a scene. So today, for example, on a totally other kind of book, which I don't know if I'll ever have published, but I'm really enjoying writing it, I wrote a whole scene, and then I wrote a tiny section of the next scene, so that I'll know where to go the next day, where to start. I don't know where it's going, but I'll know where to start. And that's pretty well it. If I'm doing anything that isn't creative, like, for example, they've sent me the substantive edits that have to be done and all of that, I can do that in the afternoon, right? I can answer correspondence in the afternoon. I can do all that kind of thing when it's not where my creative brain is. And that is absolutely first thing in the morning. Is that same for you as well?
It's all day long. I sort of,
All day long. Oh my God.
I often do my chores and that in the morning, I have to admit, but it flips every now and then. Anyhow, this isn't about me. Is there a target number?
No, don't talk.
Okay. Is there a target number of words that you write per day, or that you aim for? And how long does it take you to write that first draft?
I would say the first draft is going to be anywhere between 4 and 6 months, because I'm pretty steady. I write 5 days a week. The weekends I take off.
Mhm.
I drink cocktails and eat sweets.
And your cocktails are wonderful. I see them on Facebook.
Oh, yes. That was for who used to be the president. Like to, I think in my head about 1,500 words kind of thing, but sometimes I go over, sometimes I come a little short, because it's a scene and it's contained itself, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm not too religious about it. When I wrote my first book and I was still working, I was very religious about those 400 words a day. But I would disappoint myself now if I only wrote 400 words.
And that's a good lead into, I'm hoping you'll give us a little reading of Framed in Fire. Just give
Yes.
everyone a taste of the latest book.
I will read, if I may, and it is very, very brief, the prologue, because as is often the case in my books, there's something critical in the prologue of each of the books that I want the reader to carry with them and ask questions about as they go through the book. That's really what it's about. And in this particular case, I think the central crime, the central sin, the central loss takes place in this prologue. The man stopped the car. He got out and, standing for a moment, gazed along the edge of the forest. The evening was almost golden, the way the clouds filtered the setting sun. Even the air, with the March chill closing in, felt fresh, just as he loved it. There was another car nearby, its hood shining in the sun. Someone fishing, no doubt. He could hear the creek cascading over the rocks toward the lake. He went along the path that he knew so well. Approaching the cottage, he didn't think about what he would say. He pushed open the small gate and walked up the 2 steps to the door. A crow called out from somewhere in the forest, its voice rising over the sound of the water. He listened to that call, gravelly and dark, the way crows are, and smiled. He did not think it a warning. He turned and rested his hand on the doorknob. There was a male voice and the door was thrown open. A tall man filled the doorway. "What do you want?" The voice was low and furious, the "you" emphasized, as if the man had warned him off before. And then the man in the doorway turned his head slightly without removing his eyes from the man on the step and called out, "Get me that rifle." The surprised man put up his hands, chest high, palms outward, a gesture of calm. He wanted to say, "Take it easy," but the rifle was pointed now. What the hell was this? He stepped backward down the steps, his hands still up, in an attempt to calm. "No need for that," he managed. He heard a scream and a shot exploded into the silence. The crows flew up out of the tender trees that grew in a circle near the cottage and raised their voices in anger and fear.
That, when I read that, because I read the advanced copy, it was shocking. It shocked me, the prologue, which is very well done. And I have to say that you write descriptions so beautifully. Does that come naturally, or do you have to really work at it?
I'm not sure. I don't feel myself really working at it. I do work at some things. Um, but I think when I started writing the series, I was writing about a place that I lived in as a very, very young child. And so in some ways, I have all those very childish, almost palpable physical memories of this place, right? So when I first began to write the first book, A Killer in King's Cove, I just transported myself to standing in the place I was writing about, because I actually, as a very young child, lived in the house that Lane lives in now. So, it's easy for me to just go and be there and just select something that means that place for me. And so I think that's how it started. And I do, people have made comments about the descriptions of place before, and that makes you a bit nervous. It's like suddenly telling a caterpillar how many feet they have. But I still try to keep a deft hand on that, because you want it to infuse the sense of the moment, but you don't want it to kind of overwhelm the moment and drag the reader away. So, it's a kind of balance, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and I think that's part of that warmth people feel when they read your books, is that description of the places. So the book deals with some themes still current today, and we touched on this, even though the story alternates between two time periods, 1921 and 1948. What sparked the Indigenous storyline in this book, and did you have a message in mind when you set out to write it?
I didn't have a message really, although I think the message for all of us should be, we're not here just on our own. It really happened because I met a woman called Dr. Paula Price, who had done a wonderful book about the Sinaiks people who lived along the Columbia and that part of the Kootenays. And so I was so intrigued because she had done she's an anthropologist, an anthropological look at the reburying that was going on in the late 80s, where the Sinaiks people were taking their buried relations really back from museums and rescuing them from places that have been damned and so on, and reburying them with the correct and wonderful ceremony. And so I was intrigued about that. And I was intrigued by the fact that when I was a child there, I don't remember ever seeing any Indigenous person. And when I was talking to Dr. Price, she grew up quite nearby in Castlegar, not 20 miles away from Nelson. And she said that was true for her as well. And she is almost 2 decades younger than I am. And so I decided to read up on the people. And the thing that really, really hit me was that in 1956, the government of British Columbia declared the Sinaiks extinct. And it just struck me with such force that a people could be declared extinct by a government entity, that I think that was really the beginning of, I write books that encompass the history of the period that I'm writing about. And I didn't feel from that moment on that I could write a book without talking about this.
Yeah.
And 1956 is later than my period that I write about, but it's just all about how a people are squeezed out by settler kind of activities, mining and agriculture and damming all the rivers and all of that sort of thing. So I think that's really where it came from me, was I just couldn't. I still can't encompass how somebody can say these people are extinct.
Yeah, yeah. An underlying theme in the book deals with prejudice. with against another culture or ethnicity. How prevalent was this after the Second World War, and how difficult a topic was it for you to tackle in Framed in Fire?
I think it's always a difficult thing to tackle because you are, maybe 20 years ago, I could have used the kind of words that I heard growing up. People just very casually calling people all kinds of things that are completely beyond the pale today. And so, I pay attention to the fact that um, if people are going to read my books who are from any of the ethnicities that are characters in the books, I don't want them to be confronted with the kind of language that we heard when I was a child, and I was a child through the 50s and 60s. And people were very unguarded and very, very prejudiced and very, very, in that part of the world, very, very English. And I think that's where it all stemmed from, the idea that we were a dominion and we were, English and Christian and what have you. And so everybody else was by perforce on a lower social scale, and so it really interests me that people lived there. It was a very kind of diverse community, really. If you actually stopped and looked at it, there were Chinese people and the Japanese people and the Russians in the form of the Doukhobors, and we had Russian friends who were actually from Russia who lived there, and so I think I just wanted to share all of that, but not share the way prejudice sounded. The prejudice has its effects, and I think one of the things I was very familiar with as a young girl was people would always be extremely courteous and polite to people they were confronted with, but behind their backs they would call them names. So it's this kind of I'm not prejudiced against anybody but those people, such and such kind of thing, right?
And you weave this into the story. It's not pedantic or overdone. Like you weave it into the story. So so these themes are underlying, I would say. Would you agree, or do you?
Well, I hope that is the case. I sometimes get challenged by people who say that especially young people, that, for example, Lane as a woman in that period wouldn't be as bold as my character is, or that people would all be prejudiced, but that's, we all know that's not actually true, that there have been good people and people who sought justice all through history, even the worst times. And so I wanted to make sure that I could reflect that, and have people respond to the idea, for example, of the Sinaiks man that Lane meets, or any of the other people in the book, Constable Terrell, for example, who's the only Black person for miles around, really, in ways that are human and gentle and real. So that's, I try to keep that balance, that even the prejudiced people are humans,
And some of it's just casual prejudice. They don't even
oh
know.
my God, absolutely.
So another strand in the book is how easily rumors can destroy a person's reputation. And this was before social media and the internet. Did something in particular spark this plotline?
Well, I think possibly being a teenager might have done it, or being someone in, a teacher and then in charge of the school. And, I began, certainly as a teenager, we had no way of magnifying our prejudices and gossip and rumors. But I was always amazed by how very little it would take for someone to believe something someone was telling them. And it makes me think quite a lot about, you know, what's happening today, where they say, you know, when they talk about anti-vaxxers or whatever, that part of the problem is that people believe their closest friends. You know,
Mhm.
they trust them. And so I think the dynamic is still the same now as it was then. You know, if your very best friend that you go have coffee with tells you this terrible thing, you know, you're surprised, you're shocked, but you don't dismiss it. You know, you begin to look. People begin to look for clues that this piece of gossip might be true. You know, oh, well, I saw him do such and such, or isn't it, you know, he never did such and such. And so I think, you know, the dynamic is the same, but the ability to be massively destructive is obviously much worse now than it was then. I mean, in a small town like Nelson, you know, Darling's career can be ruined, but, you know, it's not going to, you know, it's very localized, but I think the dynamic is still the same.
Well, having grown up in a small town myself, I know that a rumor, I mean, it can ruin someone. And in a small town, everyone knows everyone, and it can be really horrific, especially something not true or even
Yes,
true, you know.
exactly.
Yeah. So without giving too much away, I noted some love storylines with some of the supporting characters. You're writing cozies which never go beyond the bedroom door, as we also spoke about that in another panel. Have you ever been tempted to write a love scene, or are you satisfied with this cozy convention?
I'm quite satisfied with it, you know, to be honest. I always remember some British comedy I was watching when I was much younger, and a woman who would be what age I am now, you know, somebody asked her something about sex, and she said, "Good grief, at my time of life, really." Think about this sort of thing. But I do recall one of my readers of my very first book, before it was conventionally published. I had published it under another name in a self-publishing thing. And one of my readers approached me on the street, on Granville Street, and said, "Oh, I love your book." And she clutched my arm and said, "Thank God there's no sex in it." And I thought, you know, you have to be, I think, very practiced, you know. So if you're going to do that, and I wanted to convey the ardor of Darling's love for Lane, really, without forcing people to go with them all the way. I mean, you know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? We know what it's about. So I just really like for people to, you know, take care of that imagining in their
Yeah.
own
Yeah.
heads, but I still want to convey the kind of passion, that, you know, because he developed a real passion for Lane. I mean, she's in love with him, but he just was, you know, knocked amidships by her. He never met a woman like her.
Yeah. And you portray that really well, I think. Lane Winslow and Darling have this deep, respectful relationship, but they're still working on the bane of many relationships, communication. What advice would you give the two of them moving forward?
You know, there's so much a product of their time, I think. You know, I'm a child of the 60s, and we blabbed everything, you know, to everybody. You know, we were in therapy and we told everybody what was going on with us. And my mother was just appalled by that kind of behavior. You know, she was extremely reserved, and, you know, always said to me, "No one cares how you feel. Why do you keep going on about how you feel?" You know, and I think both of them are very similar in that they are reserved as people and have had experiences in their lives that have deepened that reserve as opposed to bringing them out of it.
Mhm.
So, you know, Lane has an unfortunate family background, except for her lovely grandparents, and has had this unfortunate love affair, and is just, very comfortable with who she is and quite reserved. And Darling has an almost similar background. He has the unfortunate love affair with a pilot in England, and one of these wonderful women who used to fly planes with no instruments from the factory to the airfields where all the instruments would then be put in, so that the pilots could fly them with instruments. And I think the advice I'd give is, just say it, because so much goes on if people don't just say it. And sometimes when you're very reserved, it's very hard to say something, even to someone that you really love and really trust. You feel like you're going to lose something, but in fact, it's the exact opposite. So I really hope that they'll have the opportunity to overcome. And I think in this book, they do. Like Lane is, wakes up very frightened because she has PTSD a little bit, and she doesn't want to say anything because she's ashamed of it. But luckily that Darling is there, and he kind of tweezes it out a little bit, and then she's able to share it. And I think that just has to be something they get more practiced at.
Yeah, as most couples, I think.
Exactly.
That issue. Can you anticipate more books in the series? Or how many more are you planning?
In fact, I've just delivered number 10, the book that follows this one. So we'll see how that goes over. And I do have an idea for another one after that. So we'll see. It's always just a little smidgen of. Somebody asked Ian Rankin today, how many books was he thinking about at the time, and he was very firm, only one. I get my one idea and it's going to be a book, and I don't get another one till I'm finished, kind of thing, right? Yeah. I tend to, I alight on something and I go, oh my God, this would be so amazing to write about. So I'm kind of at that stage with the book that comes after the 10th book.
Does the 10th book have a title yet that you can share, or you?
No, it doesn't have a title yet, but it comes in small measure because someone once asked me at one of my appearances, why do we never hear about Lane's sister?
Interesting.
So, and I wanted to include a little bit of my mother's actual work that she did in South Africa. She didn't tell me much because, they never tell you anything, spies. That's the whole point of them. But I built on that a little bit. So
as a child, did you have any idea that your mom was capable of being a spy, or did that just?
I thought my mom was capable of absolutely anything, which was very terrifying. But I knew my grandfather was a spy, so someone must have told me, because I remember as a child, my favorite game, was to write. We lived out, in the countryside, and I would spend hours pretending I was a spy, running around and hiding in the underbrush and all of that. And I think it's because I somehow must have heard that my grandfather was a spy, but I didn't really understand that my mother was until very near her death, when she finally kind of said, oh yes, I did this thing. And I was like, why are you writing books about bears in Kootenay Lake? I said to her, because she was a writer, when you could be writing a story that no one else can write, about your period in South Africa.
Yeah.
So
interesting. Eric, do we have any questions from the audience? I guess it's time to check in. There he is.
Hey, timing is perfect.
Good.
Actually, since you brought back spies, it's not a question but a comment from Wendy. She said writers would make perfect spies, going around the world on book tours all the time, gathering intelligence on the enemy. Potentially a book idea.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
It's an excellent idea, Wendy. Get cracking on it.
And considering your family's history in spies, perhaps there's things you can't tell us right now, Iona. She also had a question. I don't think it's a fair question, so I'm going to spin it a little bit, but I can also ask it to Brenda. The question was, when you are writing a series of books, do you prepare yourself and your publisher to say that you have the last book in the series? So basically thinking about tying up loose ends and writing a ending that satisfies our readers. Now you just mentioned that book 11 is already permeating in your brain.
Yeah.
But do you ever consider, do you have an end, a thought of an end? It may not be book 11, 12, 13, or 14, but do you
The wonderful women who have gone before me, like Louise Penny, I think she's written 20 books at least. Gail Bowen's written at least that many. I mean, I don't feel any particular impetus to stop right now, really. So, you know, I have been asked about, you know, what about Lane's wartime experience, you know, so, you know, that might be a potential something at one point. I've written a couple of short stories about her wartime experience, you know, and those could perhaps become a kind of prequel
Really
or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, but that would involve a whole other kind of research as well, you know. So I would have to prepare my mind for it, because in the meantime, I have this other idea I'd really like to just pursue.
A different series or still with Lane?
No, well, no, for the 11th book, I do have another series that I'm working on where I've written one book, and it takes place in just outside the town of Rye in the Cinque Port in East Sussex, just after the First World War. So again, I'm going in just after a war has ended, right? And I've written 1.5 books in that series, and I really quite enjoy it. You know, the character is a young girl who's the daughter of a local physician, you know. So anyway, I'm enjoying that. I don't know what's going to happen with it, but that's kind of my interlude between Lane books. You know, I send out my manuscript and then I go back to this one.
Did history always fascinate you? Were you a student?
Always.
Yeah.
Always, from dot. As long as I can remember, I've been a history buff, and I've loved historical novels. I'm sure I learned most of what I know about history from historical novels, which could or could not be reliable.
You have a unique name, and when I saw your name on a children's book, I'm assuming that was you. Did you ever think of writing children again?
I actually wrote a number of books for children, and no one seemed interested in them, so I've tucked them away. Henry and the Cow Problem did very well for me, and I'm quite fond of it. But even it was remaindered after about 20 or 25 years. So I don't know, you know, there's a limited amount of time.
Yes. Brenda, I know it's not about you, but you did end a very successful series. So what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was hard, but I felt this, I ended 2 series in the same year, and I felt it was time for both. But tying up those loose ends is a challenge for sure.
Vanessa asked, talking about your research, what was the most surprising thing that you learned while doing research?
You know, I don't know why this was so, well, it was very surprising. I think the most surprising thing I learned was when I was studying the matter of the Sudetenland refugees, because, you know, we're in the middle of a war, and well, we're not, we're about to start a war with Germany. It's 1939. And, you know, already there's rising prejudice against Germans on the prairies and so on, because we know we're going to go to war against Germany. You know, we have, you know, prejudice against Japanese, and soon we're going to bring them in and put them in camps and take everything away from them. But right in the middle of all of this, Canada brings a whole load of actual Germans into the country. I just thought that was so interesting. I mean, they were anti-Nazi Germans for sure, and many of them, once they'd settled, signed up to work, signed up, what do you call it, enlisted, and so on. But I just thought that was so amazing because it seemed just to be going against the tide. So anyway.
That's a juicy tidbit. Leslie Taylor actually has a very interesting question. What about the question of children? Married women in the 1940s typically had children. Will you address this issue in one of your books?
I'm being asked this more and more. And I'm going to now hide behind this. My mother she was quite young when she had my brother, but let's just think about me. She had me when she was 36.
Oh.
And it was quite common for the women in my family to have their children really late. My aunt, my father's sister, had her children at 42 and 44. So I think, I can afford to wait a little bit. Because you really have to think, okay, what's this going to be like once there's a baby on the hip?
Yeah. Babies change everything.
But my mother would never have let that, by the way, get in the way of her adventures. But Lane is slightly different, I think.
It's true, because you mentioned Ian Rankin earlier this morning, and he was saying, I never should have wrote that dog. So
you know what, I was going to write into the chat that I solved that problem by having the dog be the neighbor's dog. So we can still enjoy the dog, but Lane never has to worry about going off and leaving the dog behind.
Oh, if only Ian had listened or talked to you first. One of the guests asked, do you have any advice for inspiring new writers?
My only advice is the very one that I followed, and that is just to write. And don't get too excited about whether it's any good. I do actually have some sort of rules that I actually follow, but I set them out for myself at the beginning because I was quite uncertain as I began the process of writing these books. And one of them is to, under no circumstances on any given day when I'm writing, to go back and erase things, to blank them out. So if I write a sentence I think is like the most cliched, ridiculous, stupid sentence in the world, I'm not allowed to go back and erase it. I have to keep going. Then I'm going to look at it again tomorrow. And, I don't know what sentences do at night. They sort themselves out and become quite respectable. So when you see them again, you are pretty pleased that you wrote that, or indeed you see the cliche and then you change it. But don't do it at the time, because it absolutely thwarts the ability to just flow through and continue to write. So I think that's my biggest thing is to write and to not imagine anybody reading it. Just write it because you want to say it.
Brenda, I don't know if you're watching the Q&A at all, but Dave Butler had a comment. So he said, I had a question. A wonderful conversation between two of my favorite Canadian writers and friends. Thank you.
He's one of
Iona.
We planted him there.
What kind of feedback have you had from locals in the Nelson area about your books being set there?
Thank you for asking that. This was the subject of an enormous amount of fear on my part when I first started writing them, because I really worried that people in the area would sort of say, how dare she, she hasn't lived here since she was 5, and what's she doing, and all of that. And honestly, people have been absolutely amazing. They've embraced the books. They take little trips up to the real King's Cove, which is not called that, and kind of drive around and look at things. And I think they really appreciate, that beautiful part of the world being highlighted in some ways. So almost all the, I don't think I've ever had any really negative feedback from anyone in the area. They do seem pleased.
We tend to be asking this question a lot during this conference, but it's a fun one, and I'm going to ask it to both of you. What are you currently reading?
Brenda, what are you currently reading?
I just, well, I just came back from France and read a couple of books over there. I was reading Jane Harper. She's a terrific Australian writer. She's got four standalones out. I really recommend her. What else did I read? I'm not sure. And I'm now just starting to read a book that someone's asked me to read to give a possible cover quote for them.
Yes, we all have a lot of those, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I am reading Barchester Chronicles, just rereading it. I think I read them back in my 30s. I'm a huge lover of 19th century literature, so I read quite a bit anyway, always in the background. And I'm also reading a wonderful book by an American author who is Lakota, I think, called The Seed Keepers. And it's very good. And I'm sorry I don't have it here to give you her name, but it's a wonderful book.
Someone's actually interested about your mom. Just you said earlier on that your mom wrote about bears and the Kootenays. Is there any way to see a copy of this? Was it published?
Of my mom's books?
Yes.
You know, it's funny, people every now and then send me a note saying, oh my God, I found one of your mom's books on you know, online somewhere. She wrote 2 books, actually. One was called As Far As You'll Take Me, and that was the story of her hitchhiking with interstate truckers all the way up to Alaska. And then what she did there, she took an evening gown with her because you never know, and had occasion to use it. And then the second one she wrote was all about our lives in Mexico. We went to live in Mexico because my father went to work there. And I think his intention was we would stay here and he would come back periodically. And my mother said, the heck with that. So my brother was put into a private school and my mother and I drove down to Mexico, where I more or less stayed until I was 13. And I think I was about 5 at the time. And she wrote a book called Mexico Unknown. So those are both out there somewhere. And her name is Lorna Whishaw.
What a fascinating life you've led, Iona.
Well, just in her wake, really.
One last question. I think we have time for it, and I'll ask it to both of you. Do you ever get writer's block, and how do you get past it?
I don't. And I think it's because of what I said earlier about how I write. I'm not, you know, I'm not searching for an idea because I know one will come. I mean, a truism for me is you don't know what you know until you write it. And so for me, writing is the method of thinking. Writing is thinking. Is really how I compress that. So typically if I go, okay, I've got 20 minutes to write, I'll sit down and I'll write something. And you know, I just haven't, knock on wood, until now had to deal with that. What about you, Brenda?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, that writing is thinking. When I'm trying to sort out something and I can't really figure it out in my head, I just sit down and start writing and it comes out. And it's interesting to see how it comes out. So I agree. I don't think I've had writer's block per se. You know, just working out something, but not a block.
Not a block, exactly.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Before wrapping things up, something's happened for the first time in this conference. Somebody asked me a question. Wendy asked, what am I reading then? I would tell you that I have a couple of interviews coming up. So I'm reading people, I'm researching and reading the people I'm going to interview very soon, which is Nate Headley and Rick Mafina, who both, one's been a guest and one will be a guest at this conference. And another thing, I'm going to put this in the chat, is I just bought a bunch of books from a lot of people who are at the conference here this week. And the bookstore, the online bookstore. I'm going to put that link in the chat so you can all see it and also buy your book. Any final comments, Brenda or Iona?
I'd like to thank Iona. I could chat with you all day, Iona. It's just been,
Yeah, it's been really fun.
yeah,
I wish I was learning more about you, but we'll talk.
it's not about me.
It's been lovely. I just want to thank the Maple Leaf Conference for inviting me. It's been absolutely great. And
Excellent.
Brenda, you asked wonderful questions.
Oh, well, thank you. You'll give good answers.
Brenda.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, bye, Brenda. Bye, Eric.